Did you know that the scariest vampire in Salem's Lot was never supposed to look the way he did? The original plan was something completely different, but one wild idea changed everything, and audiences were left sleeping with the lights on for weeks. Salem's Lot arrived in 1979 and turned a quiet little town into the stuff of nightmares. It was based on Stephen King's terrifying novel, and it scared people in ways no one expected. Let's dive in and discover 20 weird and amazing facts about Salem's Lot. Number 20. The tone that almost wasn't before cameras ever rolled. The production team had a serious problem. They needed a town that looked old, forgotten, and just a little bit wrong. They searched across many parts of California, driving down quiet roads and walking through small communities. They needed houses with peeling paint, streets where trees blocked the sunlight, and a place that already felt like it was slowly dying. They eventually found what they were looking for in Ferndale and surrounding areas. These communities had old Victorian architecture, tall pointed rooftops, wide front porches, and narrow windows that seemed to stare back at you like eyes. With just a few small changes, these real towns transformed into the fictional Jerusalem's Lot, but some residents were not happy about it. There were quiet complaints and awkward conversations between the crew and locals. The filmmakers had to promise to restore everything exactly as they found it. In the end, the chosen locations gave the movie an authenticity that no studio set could have matched. The creaking porches were real. The shadows were real. The strange stillness of those streets was completely real, and that reality made the horror feel that much closer to home. Number 19. Stephen King's first reaction. Stephen King had already seen his work adapted for the screen before Salem's Lot came along. When director Tobe Hooper came on board to adapt the story for television, King was curious but cautious. The novel was deeply personal to him, a story about vampires taking over a small Maine town, but also a story about how communities fall apart when people stop paying attention. King was given some involvement in the early stages, but was not in control of every creative decision. The decision to make it a television miniseries rather than a theatrical film changed the pace and structure of the story. Television in the late 1970s had different rules: things you could not show, language you could not use, and commercial breaks that interrupted the tension. But when King eventually watched the finished product, something surprised him. The longer runtime allowed the story to breathe. Characters had more time to develop. The town had time to feel lived in before the horror arrived. King appreciated that slow build, that creeping sense of wrongness. He did not love everything, but he respected the craft, and sometimes that is enough. Number 18. Tobe Hooper's Big Gamble. By 1979, Tobe Hooper was already a horror legend. He had directed the Texas Chainsaw Massacre in 1974, a film so raw and disturbing it changed the horror genre forever. So when Salem's Lot came along, everyone was watching Hooper closely. Could he bring that same intensity to a television production? Hooper understood something important about horror. The scariest thing is not always what you see. It is what you almost see. It is the shape at the window. It is the shadow that should not be there. He used this philosophy carefully throughout Salem's Lot, knowing that television censors would not allow him to show certain things openly. So he found creative ways to suggest them instead. A reaction shot, a held breath, a door slowly swinging open. His gamble was that audiences were smart enough to fill in the blanks themselves. And he was right. Viewers across America sat in their living rooms and terrified themselves with their own imaginations. Hooper gave them the ingredients, and they baked the nightmare themselves. That is a rare and special skill in a director. What looked like a TV limitation became his greatest creative tool. Number 17. The actor who almost said no. David Soul, who played lead character Ben Mears, was one of the most recognizable faces on American television. He was best known for playing Detective Ken Hutchinson in Starsky and Hutch, which had made him a household name. But Salem's Lot was a different kind of story, darker, stranger, and more psychologically demanding. When the project first came to David Soul, he hesitated. He was not sure he wanted to be associated with vampire horror. His image at the time was warm and heroic, and signing on to a story about blood-drinking creatures felt like a risky step sideways. But Soul read the script carefully, and something changed his mind. It was not the horror elements that convinced him. It was Ben Mears himself, a writer who returns to his haunted childhood hometown looking for answers, and instead finds something far worse waiting. That combination of emotional wound and buried fear appealed to Soul as an actor. He saw a real human being underneath the horror story, and so he said yes. His performance became one of the anchors of the entire production. He brought warmth and vulnerability to a story that could have felt cold and distant, because when someone we trust is afraid, we become afraid too. That wasn't just smart casting, that was storytelling wisdom. Number 16. The vampire design that shocked everyone. This is one of the most talked about facts surrounding Salem's Lot. In Stephen King's novel, the master vampire Kurt Barlow was described as a sophisticated, charming European figure. He could speak. He could reason. He wore fine clothes and carried himself with elegance. But when director Tobe Hooper sat down with his production team, they made a radical decision. They were heavily inspired by a famous German silent film called Nosferatu, made in 1922. In that film, the vampire Count Orlok was not elegant or charming. He was animal-like, inhuman, and deeply disturbing. Pointed ears, bald head, long clawed fingers, eyes that caught light in an unsettling way. Hooper's team took Barlow in that same direction. Their version would not speak. He would not reason with you. He would simply appear, pale, terrifying, and utterly without mercy. The makeup design was extraordinary. Barlow's skin was corpse blue, his eyes were yellow and glowing, his mouth was filled with sharp, vicious teeth. When audiences saw him for the first time, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Children hid behind their parents. Adults reportedly turned off the TV. Stephen King himself had mixed feelings. He loved the original Barlow from his novel, but even he admitted the visual impact of the television version was extraordinary. What they built was not what he imagined, but it was unforgettable. Number 15. The window scene that broke America. If you ask anyone who watched Salem's Lot as a child what they remember most, 9 times out of 10 they will describe the same scene. A young boy floats outside his friend's bedroom window. His eyes are wrong. His skin is wrong. He taps gently on the glass. He smiles. And then he asks to be let in. The scene featured the character Danny Glick, and getting it right required careful technical and emotional work. The actor was suspended by a harness connected to wires just above the window frame, and a camera was positioned so that none of the rigging was visible. Getting the expression right was the hardest part. The director wanted something that felt deeply wrong, not angry, not obviously threatening, but quietly and sweetly disturbing. A smile that should not exist on a child's face in the middle of the night. The lighting was also carefully designed. The boy was lit from below and from the side, creating unnatural shadows across his face. When they finally captured it on film, everyone on set knew they had something special. The image became one of the most iconic horror images of its entire decade. What looked simple was the result of hours of precise, careful work, and what looked sweet was the most frightening thing of all. Number 14. James Mason and the Art of Quiet Evil. One of the greatest casting decisions in the entire production was choosing James Mason to play Richard Straker, the human companion and servant of the vampire Barlow. Mason was a British actor with decades of extraordinary work behind him, and he carried himself with an effortless elegance. He was the perfect counterpoint to the animalistic, non-speaking Barlow. Where Barlow was all instinct and visual terror, Straker was all civility and cold intelligence. He ran an antique shop in Jerusalem's Lot with perfect manners and a warm smile, slowly gaining the trust of the townspeople while quietly arranging for their destruction. Mason understood this character completely. He played Straker not as a villain who announces himself, but as a gentleman who makes you feel comfortable right up until the moment he doesn't. There is a particular scene where Straker speaks calmly about very disturbing things. His voice never rises. His face barely changes, and yet the combination of his pleasant manner with the terrible content of his words creates a feeling of deep wrongness that is almost unbearable. Mason reportedly researched the novel carefully before filming, developing a detailed personal history for Straker that never appeared on screen but informed every choice he made. That invisible depth is what separated his performance from what it could have been in lesser hands. Quiet evil is the hardest kind to play, and Mason made it look effortless. Number 13. The child actor's real fear. Several young actors were cast in Salem's Lot, and working on a horror production presented unique challenges for all of them. The sets were designed to feel genuinely unsettling: dim corridors, flickering lights, and makeup that transformed fellow actors into creatures barely recognizable as human. The production team tried to be careful and considerate with the younger cast members, explaining each scene before filming and making sure parents were always nearby. But the atmosphere of the production sometimes crossed the line from pretend to truly uncomfortable. During night shoots at the Marston House set, when the bright work lights were replaced by moody, low-key filming lights, the atmosphere shifted completely. Some of the younger actors admitted in later interviews that they did not fully separate the fictional world from the reality around them during those long nights. When a fellow actor in full Barlow makeup stepped around a corner unexpectedly, the reaction was not always performed fear. Sometimes it was genuine shock. The makeup was simply that effective. The director was actually grateful for this. Genuine surprise and discomfort read differently on camera than performed emotion. There is a quality to real fear that is almost impossible to fake, and some of the most authentic-looking moments of terror in the film came from exactly these unplanned instances. That wasn't acting. It was real fear, and the camera knew the difference. Number 12. The night shoot that never ended. There is a particular sequence in Salem's Lot that required several nights of filming in actual outdoor locations, not on a set, but in a real neighborhood in the middle of the night. On the first night of filming, things began to go wrong in ways no amount of preparation could have prevented. The weather changed unexpectedly. A cold front moved through, dropping temperatures dramatically and bringing with it a heavy, damp fog. The fog was, from a visual standpoint, absolutely beautiful. It drifted between the old houses in thick ribbons, catching the light from the crew's lamps and creating an otherworldly atmosphere that no production designer could have planned. Everyone agreed immediately that the fog should become part of the scene. But fog also made everything else harder. Cables became slippery. Communication between the director and camera operators was more difficult. Actors had to hit their marks without being able to see clearly in the murky darkness. What was planned as a 2-night shoot stretched to 4 nights. The crew was exhausted. The actors were fighting fatigue and physical discomfort, but the footage they captured was extraordinary. The organic, unplanned quality of that fog gave those scenes a texture that pure technical filmmaking could never have achieved. What started as a weather problem became one of the production's most beautiful accidents. It looked like magic. It felt like chaos. Number 11. The censorship battles behind the scenes producing a horror story for network television in 1979 came with a very specific set of challenges. The network had strict standards about what could and could not be shown on screen. Violence had limits, certain imagery was forbidden, and anything involving children in frightening situations was watched particularly carefully. For a story where children becoming vampires is a central part of the horror, this created real tension between the filmmakers and network executives. The floating child scene was reviewed carefully for content before it was cleared to air. The network worried the imagery would be too disturbing for a general audience. Barlow's appearances were also subject to scrutiny. His design was powerful enough that network representatives considered shortening or cutting certain close-up shots of his face. Tobe Hooper argued firmly for keeping the full impact of the imagery, understanding that Barlow's effectiveness as a villain depended almost entirely on that initial overwhelming visual shock. He won most of those arguments, but not all of them. The result is a production that sits in a fascinating middle space, restrained enough for 1979 network television, but intense enough that it feels more like a film than a typical TV show. The censorship battles, rather than weakening the production, sometimes forced more creative solutions. What they could not show directly, they suggested. And the suggestion was often more powerful. What looked like a limitation became something stranger and better. Number 10. The music that made the horror complete. Great horror films often have great scores, and Salem's Lot is no exception. The music was composed with a specific intention, not to announce the scary moments with loud dramatic chords, but to create an underlying unease that never quite goes away. The score works almost subliminally, planting a low, quiet discomfort in a background of scenes that might otherwise seem calm. The composer made several important decisions early in the process. First, silence would be used as a weapon. There would be long stretches where the music simply stopped, and the natural sound of the world, wind in trees, footsteps on floorboards, the distant sound of a door would carry the scene alone. When the music returned after these silences, the contrast made it feel more powerful than if it had been playing continuously. Second, the instrumentation was chosen carefully. High, wavering strings suggest vulnerability and anxiety. Low brass notes suggest something large and inevitable approaching. The score leaned into these associations deliberately, combining them in unusual ways to create a sound that was both familiar and deeply wrong. The theme associated with Barlow was designed to feel less like music and more like a physical sensation. Viewers who describe watching Salem's Lot for the first time often mention a feeling of unease could not entirely explain or locate. The music was doing exactly what it was designed to do, working quietly, shaping emotions, making the ordinary feel dangerous. Old notes. New nightmares. Number 9. The realistic relationship at the heart of the horror, at the center of Salem's Lot, surrounded by all the supernatural darkness, is a love story. Ben Mears and Susan Norton meet in Jerusalem's Lot as two people dealing with their own separate complications, and their relationship develops with a naturalness and warmth that grounds the entire production. Without this emotional center, the horror around it would feel disconnected, a series of scare scenes without a human reason to care. The actors who played these roles, David Soul and Bonnie Bedelia, worked carefully to build a believable connection. They spent time together outside of filming, talking through their characters' backgrounds and finding the specific rhythms of how two particular people would speak and move around each other. Director Tobe Hooper prioritized these early scenes between Ben and Susan, giving them space and time to develop without rushing toward the genre elements. By the time the supernatural threat became undeniable, the audience already cared deeply about both characters. That caring made every subsequent dangerous moment feel personal and urgent. There is a particular quiet scene between Ben and Susan. No monsters, no darkness, where the tenderness between them almost hurts to watch because you already know what is coming, and they don't. That knowledge, the audience seeing the danger the characters cannot, is one of the oldest and most powerful tools in storytelling, not just terror. Real heartbreak underneath the terror. Number 8. The Marston House that took on a life of its own. The Marston House, the old, dark mansion sitting above Jerusalem's Lot like a dark crown, is one of the most important characters in the entire story. It cannot speak. It has no eyes or voice, and yet every person who watches Salem's Lot understands instinctively that the house is alive in some way that matters. Creating this effect required exceptional work from the production design team. The external structure used was a real Victorian building dressed and lit with extraordinary care. Every angle was considered. The approach to the house was designed so that it always appeared slightly uphill, something above you, looking down. The windows were positioned in shots so they consistently fell at eye level with the viewer, creating the unsettling impression of being observed. Inside, the practical sets carried a different but equally unsettling quality. Rooms were too large or too small in ways that were subtle but uncomfortable. Furniture was chosen to look as if arranged by someone whose understanding of how rooms should feel was slightly wrong. Tobe Hooper filmed the house in ways that suggested it had interiority, a slow push toward a window, a lingering shot of a closed door, a staircase filmed from below so its upper portion disappeared into shadow. By the time the film reached its climax, many viewers reported fearing the house itself as much as any supernatural creature within it, a building made of wood and glass and old paint, and yet somehow alive. What should have been just a set became something that breathed. Number 7. The tone that stayed scared. When Salem's Lot aired over 2 nights in November of 1979, the reaction from audiences was immediate and extraordinary. Letters poured into the network. People called radio stations to talk about their experiences. Teachers reported that children were coming to school visibly shaken, discussing specific scenes with the kind of detail that only genuine fear produces. There were documented reports of children refusing to open their bedroom windows at night, a direct result of the floating child scene. Local news stations ran follow-up pieces interviewing child psychologists about whether the program had been appropriate for young viewers. The conversation about horror and children and what was suitable for television was happening in living rooms, school cafeterias, and newspaper opinion sections across the country. The actual filming locations, those real towns in California, saw a small but noticeable increase in curious visitors after the broadcast. People drove out to look at the houses where scenes had been filmed, standing on sidewalks and looking up at the old Victorian architecture with new eyes. This cultural aftershock was something Stephen King understood very well from his novel. His original story was always partly about the stories a community tells itself. The reaction to the television adaptation demonstrated exactly that. A story told convincingly enough can change how people see the real world around them. That is not just entertainment. That is something much more powerful, and that power was real. Number 6. Stephen King visits the set. Stephen King visited the set of Salem's Lot during production, and the experience was genuinely interesting for everyone involved. The cast and crew knew who he was, the man who had written the source material they were all working so hard to bring to life. There was an understandable mix of excitement and slight nervousness surrounding his visit. King moved through the set quietly, observing more than commenting. He watched the makeup process for Barlow's character design with particular attention, studying every detail of the transformation. He spent time on the Marston House set, walking through the rooms the production designers had constructed. He spoke with several actors, asking how they had approached their roles. The moment that people who were present tend to remember most is when King stood in the main street of the location town and simply looked around. He stood quietly for a long moment, taking in the old buildings, the narrow street, the way the trees pressed in close from both sides. And then he said something to the effect that the place already looked like somewhere his story could have happened, that it had the right feeling. For a production that had worked so hard to find and dress the right locations, that was enormous validation. One honest sentence from the man who invented the world they were trying to recreate. The real author standing inside the real version of his imaginary town. That was a strange and perfect moment. Number 5. The broadcast night that stopped America when Salem's Lot aired over 2 consecutive nights in November of 1979, the ratings were extraordinary. Millions of Americans sat down in front of their television sets and did not leave. The first night drew a massive audience, and the second night drew an even larger one. A remarkable accomplishment in the era before social media or streaming. The reason so many people tuned in for the second night was simple. The people who watched the first night told everyone they knew that they had to see the rest of it. They described specific scenes with the vivid detail of people who had been genuinely affected. The floating child at the window. The Marston House against the dark sky. James Mason's calm, terrible smile. Families watched together. College students gathered in dormitory common rooms around shared television sets. There is a particular quality to being afraid alongside other people. It is simultaneously more intense and more manageable than being afraid alone. You can laugh a little. You can squeeze someone's hand. You can say that was terrifying and have someone agree with you. The collective nature of that 2-night viewing experience created a shared cultural memory that lasted for decades. People who were children in 1979 still talk about Salem's Lot with a specific kind of reverence. The reverence you feel for something that genuinely got to you and left a mark. That is the rarest achievement in horror, and Salem's Lot earned it completely. America watched. America was afraid, and America remembered. Number 4. The effect on horror television forever. Before Salem's Lot aired in 1979, horror on American television was a relatively cautious and limited genre. There were ghost stories and thriller anthologies, but nothing that committed fully to the dark, sustained atmosphere of genuine horror the way a theatrical film might. The idea that a network television production could generate real fear seemed improbable. Salem's Lot changed that assumption permanently. Its success, both in ratings and in the cultural conversation that followed, demonstrated that audiences were willing to be genuinely frightened by what they saw on their home screens. More importantly, it showed that they wanted to be. Many of the letters that flooded the network in the days after broadcast were from viewers who had been scared and who loved it. In the years that followed, the landscape of horror television shifted noticeably. Productions became bolder. Miniseries formats became more popular for adapting long-form horror material. The relationship between Stephen King and television deepened significantly. His work went on to be adapted for the small screen many times in the following decades, with each production owing something to the trail that Salem's Lot had blazed. The people working in horror television through the 1980s and 1990s knew what had come before them. Many had been scared by Salem's Lot as children, and they carried that experience into their own work, passing the lesson forward. One production, one terrified audience, one changed medium. Number 3. The lost footage mystery. Like many productions from the late 1970s, Salem's Lot has its own mystery surrounding footage that was filmed but never officially released in its original form. When the miniseries was eventually prepared for international theatrical release, edited down from its extended television runtime into a shorter film version, a significant amount of material was cut. Scenes that provided character development and connective tissue between major plot points were removed to make the running time appropriate for a movie theater. Some cut footage has been discussed in interviews over the years. There were scenes between Ben Mears and other town residents that deepened the understanding of how the vampire infection spread gradually through the community. Secondary characters simply disappeared from the theatrical version without explanation, leaving international audiences confused about certain plot points. The most intriguing lost material involves scenes reportedly filmed but never broadcast even in the original television version, scenes cut during the editing process before the miniseries ever aired. Details are fragmentary and come from sources with varying reliability. There are suggestions that at least one cut scene involved a significantly different presentation of Barlow in an earlier portion of the story. Whether this footage exists somewhere in an archive or was destroyed years ago, nobody knows for certain. The mystery around lost footage carries a particular charge when it involves a story like Salem's Lot, a story about things that hide, things that wait, things that are there, somewhere, even when you cannot find them. Something is always missing, and the missing piece is always the most interesting one. Number 2. The novel's deeper warning. Salem's Lot is not really about vampires. Vampires are the vehicle, vivid, frightening, and visually extraordinary, but they are a metaphor for something more grounded and more universal. The story is about how a community can quietly fall apart when people stop paying attention to each other. It is about how evil does not arrive with a declaration and a banner. It arrives quietly, through a back door, in the shape of something charming and reasonable. It takes hold slowly, one person at a time, until the ones who remember what things used to be like are outnumbered by those who have already changed. Stephen King wrote this story in the early 1970s, but its themes were not new then and are not old now. Every generation finds in Salem's Lot a warning that feels specifically designed for their own moment. That is the mark of genuine literature, the ability to speak differently to different readers across different times while always saying something essentially true about who we are and what we fear. The production that Tobe Hooper and his entire team built in 1979 found a way to carry those themes through the specific language of cinema: light and shadow, music and silence, a face glimpsed through a window, a door opening onto darkness. These are not just techniques, they are the grammar of a particular kind of storytelling. And Salem's Lot spoke that grammar fluently and fearlessly. What began as a novel became a cultural memory, and the memory is not finished. It never is. Number 1. The legacy that refuses to die. 45 years after it first aired, Salem's Lot remains one of the most discussed and respected horror productions in television history. That kind of lasting power is not accidental. It is the result of specific, intelligent, creative choices made by specific people under specific pressures, and a story strong enough at its foundation to carry everything built on top of it. The production has been revisited, reimagined, and remade in the years since 1979. Each new version pays its debt to the original, whether it acknowledges that debt openly or not. The floating child at the window has become a permanent part of horror's visual vocabulary. The image of Barlow, pale, glowing-eyed, utterly inhuman, still appears in conversations about the most effective monster designs in film history. James Mason's quietly sinister performance still serves as a textbook example of how to play a human villain with maximum impact and minimum noise. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of Salem's Lot is simpler than any specific scene or performance or design choice. It is the proof that horror can live anywhere, including your living room, on an ordinary Tuesday evening, with the familiar comfort of a television screen. It does not need a dark theater. It does not need a surround sound system or a massive budget. It needs a strong story told honestly by people who believe in what they are making. Salem's Lot had all of those things. And 45 years later, the lights are still going on. The windows are still being checked. The darkness outside is still a little darker than it used to be. That is the legacy. Still alive. Still watching. Still waiting. Bonus fact, the secret second ending nobody talks about. Here is something that almost no one discusses when Salem's Lot comes up, and it is one of the most fascinating creative decisions in the entire production's history. When the miniseries was being edited for its international theatrical release, the version seen by audiences outside the United States in movie theaters rather than on television. The team made a very significant choice about the ending. It was not simply a matter of shortening the runtime. They actually restructured the final moments of the narrative in ways that created a meaningfully different emotional experience from the television version. In the original television broadcast, the ending carries a specific quality, a sense of incomplete resolution, of darkness held at bay but not eliminated, of survival that feels fragile and provisional. Evil is not destroyed utterly and finally. It is wounded, retreated, waiting. The survivors are alive, but the fight is not over in any clean or satisfying way. That ambiguity was intentional and thematically appropriate for a Stephen King story where darkness rarely disappears entirely. It simply pulls back and waits for its moment. The theatrical version, compressed and reshaped for a different audience, made different choices. Scenes were reordered. The final emotional beats were adjusted to land differently in a theater setting. Some material that bridged story elements was removed entirely, changing the pace of the story's conclusion. The result was, in some ways, a fundamentally different story about the same events, reaching the same general destination by a different road and arriving in a different emotional condition. Film scholars and dedicated fans have spent years comparing the two versions, debating which represents the truest expression of the material. There is no universally agreed upon answer. Both versions have passionate defenders, and both exist as genuine, distinct artifacts of their time. What this secret second ending teaches us is something important about storytelling itself. A story is not a fixed object. It is a living thing. It can grow in different directions, be shaped by the hands that hold it, mean different things in different contexts. Salem's Lot existed as a novel, then as a television event, then as a theatrical film, and would be reimagined again in later years. Each version was shaped by its time. Each version said something true. Old story, new life. Every time, Salem's Lot is more than a horror story. At its heart, it is a story about paying attention to the places we come from, to the people around us, to the slow changes that happen when everyone is too comfortable to notice. The vampires are frightening. The images are unforgettable, but the real terror in the story is quieter and closer to home than any supernatural creature. The people who made this production in 1979 believed they were making something that mattered, and they were right. 45 years later, we are still talking about a floating child at a window, a pale face in the dark, a town that forgot to look after itself until it was too late. Great stories survive because they tell us something we need to hear, wrapped in the kind of language we cannot look away from. Salem's Lot told us to pay attention, to look at our neighbors, to notice the changes before the changes become permanent. That is not a horror message. That is a human one. And that is why we are still here talking about it all these years later. If you enjoyed these stories, subscribe for more. Every movie hides a truth, and we will keep uncovering them one story at a time.